Okay, so in the last video, we looked at Kant's intuitive reactions to various cases, or the two intuitive reactions he thinks you'll share. In this video, we'll look at how Kant thinks actions work, the various parts he thinks actions have. So here's a person, and this person is thinking a thought. She thinks, I want to get to the other side of the screen. And then she thinks, if I want to get to the other side of the screen, then I should walk. And she thinks, therefore, I should walk. And then she does that. She walks to the other side of the screen. And that's a kind of action. That's a kind of thought process that underlies an action and then the action that occurs. Now, Kant is going to label the various parts of the action. He labels the wanting to get to the other side of the screen the desire or the inclination. Those are pretty ordinary words. You can think of the conditional here, if I want to get to the other side of the screen, then I should walk, as a rule or principle that the person is following to get from one side to the other. And you could think of the walking itself as the means to the end of getting to the other side. And then being on the other side is the end or the goal or the purpose of the action. So these are the various parts of an action. You have your desire, which gets things going in ordinary cases. You have your rule or principle that you're deploying that tells you how to achieve your desire. You have the means, which is, the thing you actually do to achieve your desire. And then you have the goal or purpose or end, which is the desire being achieved. Okay, so let's now think of this as kind of a machine. So here we have a desire, bake a cake. Over here we have a bunch of rules that are kind of in your rule box. And when you have a desire to bake a cake, what you do is you sort through the rules to find a relevant rule. So you look at the first one and it says, if you're inclined to kill your friend, then use a gun. You're like, well, that doesn't help me figure out how to bake a cake. You have, if you want to walk, get to the other side of the screen, then walk. That doesn't help you figure out how to bake a cake. Then you have, if you want to bake a cake, then follow the recipe. You're like, wait a second, that's the one that helps me figure out how to bake a cake. And it gives you the means. The means is to follow the recipe. And then the goal, if it's achieved, is a cake. And this is kind of how you might think of actions. So here's, you can have different kinds of goals, like you might have a desire to kill your friend, in which case the first rule is the relevant one. You might have a desire to walk across the screen, in which case the second one is a relevant one. You might have a desire to make a friend, in which case the final one is the relevant one, and so on. Now, there's some terminology, if you did the reading, that Kant deploys, and I just want to see how that terminology maps onto what the words we're using here. Kant calls the desire and the rule together the maxim, and he says that the desire is the material part of the maxim, and the rule is the formal part of the maxim. That terminology, the material part of the maxim, the formal part of the maxim, and the word maxim itself, you don't need to know that. I don't care about that terminology. I just do want you to know that Kant thinks of an action as having these parts. It has a desire, it has a rule, it has a means, and it has a goal or an end. You can use the word goal and purpose here. There's not a lot of good substitutes for means, but like you could say the way of achieving what you want to achieve. The rule here, you could call it the principle. If you want, you can call it the formal part of the maxim, but what I'm interested in is that you understand that it's kind of like a thing that connects the desire to the end, or at least it sort of gives you your means. It tells you what your means are. And then you have your desire. Okay. So that's the anatomy of an action. And now here's Kant's argument that moral worth must come from the formal part of the maxim, which is to say moral worth must come from the rule or the principle that you're deploying. So he says, moral worth is a feature of actions. All actions have three parts: the desire, the rule, and the end. There's, of course, the fourth part, the means, but he thinks the means are just a consequence of the desire and the rule. Therefore, moral worth must come from the desire, the rule, or the end. Well, moral worth doesn't come from the end. Why should you agree to that? Well, recall the following case. You have your person who comes out and falls, and then the person who gets up to help, but then gets hit by the car before the end is achieved. And in this case, most people have the intuition or default judgment that Blue's action was morally praiseworthy, even though the end wasn't achieved. Blue didn't manage to actually help this person. And since Blue didn't manage to actually help this person, but Blue's action is still morally praiseworthy, it follows that an action can be morally praiseworthy even if its end is not achieved, and so it follows that the moral value of the action does not depend on the end. That's Kant's reasoning. Now let's look at the shopkeeper case. This also reinforces this view. Why? Well, the shopkeeper gives correct change, which is a good action, so a good end is achieved, but the idea is the action is not morally praiseworthy because it had the wrong kind of motivation. So even though the action achieves the right end, it's not morally praiseworthy, which means that the moral value can't come from the end, because if the moral value came from the end, since this is a good end, it would follow that this was a good action, a morally praiseworthy action. Okay, so those two cases, those two intuitive judgments you have about those cases, Kant uses to support the claim that moral worth doesn't come from the end. It follows, since moral worth comes from the desire, the rule, or the end, and it doesn't come from the end, then it must come from the desire or the rule. And now Kant is going to say moral worth doesn't come from the desire. And how is he going to say that? Well, recall the following cases. So here you have a case where this person says, can I go to the market? Sorry, where's the nearest market? And this person says, if I help her, then I'll feel good, so I'll help, and says that's why. And Kant's idea here is this: intuitively, Green's action is not morally praiseworthy, even though, the desire to feel good is a perfectly fine desire. And if an action isn't morally praiseworthy, even when it stems from a good desire, or a desire that's kind of acceptable, it follows that desire can't be the source of moral value. Here's another case that's also supposed to illustrate this. Remember the robot? Well, here the idea is the robot, tells the truth, and the robot tells the truth because the robot is programmed to tell the truth. And Kant says intuitively, he doesn't talk about robots, he does it in a different way, but he says intuitively, the robot's action isn't morally praiseworthy because it's not freely chosen. It's just a purely mechanistic process. And moral goodness can't come from a purely mechanistic process. That's Kant's idea. And then he says, look, you don't choose your desires, they just happen to you. And since you don't choose your desires, they just happen to you, actions that are based on desire are the result of a more or less purely mechanistic process. At the very least, the desires themselves, the desires themselves are the result of a purely mechanistic process, and this case is supposed to illustrate that moral worth can't come from a purely mechanistic process. Therefore, says Kant, moral worth can't come from desire. Well, if it must come from desire or the rule, and it can't come from desire, then we know that moral worth must come from the rule. Okay, so that was Kant using intuitions to determine that the moral worth of an action, whether it's praiseworthy, blameworthy, or neutral, must depend on the rule that's deployed in acting. Okay, we're going to stop there, and next time we'll consider what kind of rule makes an action morally praiseworthy, or blameworthy, or neutral.